Hey there, Agile Chimichangas, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we're building software in an agile manner day in and day out. Let me ask you a question. Does the size of your work items matter? And in what way does it matter? I wanted to talk about this today because fairly recently I've seen a number of posts or presentations around this issue, primarily within the context that in Kanban systems or with Little's Law or with Monte Carlo forecasts, some of the things that we encourage people to look into in this podcast, that the work items all have to be the same size or they have to be of similar size. And these contentions are not being made by scrubs. They're not being made by people who are new to the industry. They're by people who are very intelligent, experienced people in the Agile community. Maybe has more or less experience with Kanban, but they're very experienced, thoughtful people in the Agile community. So it occurred to me that this might be just kind of a common misconception. It just might be kind of one of those urban legends that's out there in the air. And as someone who has used Kanban on software projects for years and years and years, I just wanted to talk about this a little bit. What role, if any, does your work item size in these things working? And I think this is very useful for Scrum folks as well. A, because many Scrum teams are starting to adopt certain Kanban and flow practices into their Scrum. And B, it may be useful as a point of contrast when you're thinking about the way you do, say, sprint planning or thinking about your sprint backlog. I'm going to throw out there that it is not true that your work item size matters in a Kanban system or to do accurate Monte Carlo forecasts or for Little's Law to work. I'm going to use the phrase work item a lot in this podcast, and what I mean by that is whatever the smallest deliverable unit is of value that your team is working on. So for most of my teams, that's user stories. So if you're used to working with user stories, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Those small pieces, those smallest deliverable chunks, the things that we put on our Kanban board, the things that we track and forecast, the things that we put metrics around. When we're doing sprint planning, the things that we put into, say, a sprint backlog, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So I'm going to use work items because it's a little more generic. Not everybody uses user stories, but whatever that thing is for you, that's what I mean. And you do not have to try to make them the same size if you are wanting to use a Kanban strategy or if you want to do Monte Carlo forecasts in order for Little's Law to work out. So the first thing that I want to address is, where did this idea come from to begin with? That, if you're doing Kanban or flow-based metrics and things like that, that everything has to be a very similar size. And I think it's because people are coming at this question from backgrounds that are not in Kanban or flow systems, and they are kind of taking the way we're used to thinking about this issue and projecting it on to things like Monte Carlo simulations or Kanban strategies. So if you think about the way that we used to think about projects in, maybe bigger batches, like waterfallish kinds of ways of thinking about projects, or even to a lesser extent, sprint planning, we usually think about a certain amount of time and what's the amount of work we can fit into that time. And the way we normally answer that question is we look at the individual things, we think about how long those things are going to take, and we add those times together, and that's how we get our project plan, right? That's how we get our Gantt charts, or that's how we know if we've filled our sprint up or not, is by kind of adding these efforts together, and then that takes up a certain period of time, and that's how we make those forecasts. So when you're looking at something like Monte Carlo simulations or flow metrics, things that seem to magically predict the future, then you are thinking, well, the only way we've been able to do that in the past is by adding up the amount of time all these individual items take. Since these systems don't do that, ergo, every item must be of a similar size. And so it's just sort of become an ad hoc truth, sort of by deduction, really, that all these items must be the same size if you're doing Monte Carlo forecasts or using flow metrics. But that is not true. I can see why people would think that. I could see why you would arrive at that conclusion, but it's simply not true. And here's why. So the first thing I want to do is deal with Little's Law, because Little's Law is a little bit different. Little's Law, I'm not going to go into the full explanation of what it is. Feel free to look it up on the internet. Maybe we've done a podcast about Little's Law. I don't know. We can do one. Let me know if you're interested. Like, comment, subscribe. But Little's Law basically illustrates a mathematical relationship between the amount of work you have in progress, the throughput of your team, and the amount of time it takes an individual item to be done. And the upshot of it is, the more things you have going on at once, the slower everything gets, which we should probably all know from common sense anyway, but Little's Law mathematically expresses it. Little's Law deals with averages. So that's why size doesn't matter so much to Little's Law, because you're going to have big items that take a long time. You're going to have items that take a short amount of time. Little's Law is only ever dealing with averages in what it asserts. So it's always shooting for that average. So the big stuff, little stuff doesn't matter to Little's Law because it's only concerned with averages. However, Kanban flow metrics and Monte Carlo forecast, that's not the reasoning there. The reason why size doesn't matter to Kanban or Monte Carlo simulations is because what we're mostly concerned about is arrival rates and departure rates, not how long an individual item took. Now, there are other aspects where we are concerned with how long an individual item took. Work item aging, when we're talking about that metric, obviously, that's a big issue, right? Or when we talk about our cycle time trends, it can be an issue there. But when it comes to Monte Carlo simulations, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how long individual items take. The size simply does not matter because the only thing that matters are the arrival rates and the departure rates of work items. Dan Vacani, in his books on this subject, uses an analogy that I think is pretty good. And in it, he says, imagine that you're working for someone and you're in charge of their wine cellar. So you got the wine cellar, you got all these cubby holes, they're filled with bottles of wine. And every so often, the person who owns the house, they're going to grab a bottle to drink with dinner, or maybe they're throwing a party, or maybe they've got one or two people over. So wine is being consumed over time, and it's your job to keep the wine cellar full. If it's your job to keep the wine cellar full, does it matter to you at all how long the person takes to consume an individual bottle of wine? It actually doesn't matter to you at all, right? Some bottles of wine, they may drink in a night. Some bottles of wine, he may sip on, every night for the next 3 nights or 4 nights or something like that. All you have to worry about is how often are there holes that open up in the wine cellar? That's all that matters. Doesn't matter why. Doesn't matter that one wine bottle was bigger than another. Doesn't matter that he had a wild party one night and consumed a bunch of wine in a very short amount of time. It doesn't matter that he took one bottle and sipped on it for one night and took another bottle and sipped on it for a week. The only thing that matters is how often does a hole open up in that wine cellar? Well, how would you calculate that? Well, you would observe it and you'd be like, generally speaking, we lose about 3 bottles of wine a week, or we lose 5 bottles of wine a week, or my boss is Phil Ledgerwood and we lose 80 bottles of wine every 2 nights. That's what you're concerned about, because if you're concerned about the departure rate, the rate at which you burn through wine, that's all you have to worry about, because then if you know that, then you can match your arrival rate to that. So if I know I'm going to have a slot open up in the wine cellar every couple of days, then I can get a new bottle of wine every couple of days. Or if I know about 5 slots are going to open up a week, then I can order 5 new bottles of wine every week. I'm only concerned about the burn rate. Monte Carlo simulations are only concerned about the burn rate. How often do things leave the system? How often does a hole open up in the wine cellar? Monte Carlo depends on completion rate, or what we might call your throughput. So if a team normally gets about 3 work items done a week, they will probably continue to get 3 items done per week. It doesn't matter if one of those work items was very small or very large. Maybe your team has one work item that stays in process for weeks, but while that work item is in process, other smaller work items are getting done. So their completion rate is about 3 per week, right? Whether the items are big or small or indifferent, that all gets baked in to that figure, right? You're only concerned about the burn rate. Your historical rate of completion has all that variability already baked into it. And in fact, it's this focus on throughput that frees us from having to worry about things like, how many hours does the team have available this week? Or is this item a big item or a small item? None of that matters. The only thing that matters is how often do we get stuff done and how much stuff is still out there. That stuff has big items. It has small items. Most of the items are in between because by definition, the thing that happens the most often is the thing that happens the most often. And so Monte Carlo simulations are only concerned about that burn rate. And the vast majority of the management strategies incorporated in Kanban are only concerned with arrival rates and departure rates, not the age of a single work item. Now, again, I'm not saying that never comes up. It certainly does. But with regard to doing your forecasts and things like that, the size simply does not matter. The only thing that matters is how often you complete things. Whenever I make Excel do Monte Carlo simulations, the only data set I need is what's the date, how many items got done on that date. What's the next date? How many items that got done on that date? That's the only thing I need. I don't need to know when something got started. I don't need to know the date it was completed. I don't need to know that this item took 5 days and this item took 20 days. I don't need to know any of that stuff to do great Monte Carlo forecasts. I only need to know the burn rate. I only need to know the rate at which teams get things done. So I say all that to say that if you've been hesitant to try Kanban, or you've been hesitant to try Monte Carlo because you're like, well, not all of our items are the same size. That is not a requirement. You do not need your team to be making all your items the same size in order for Kanban to work. In fact, one of the beauties of Kanban and its mechanics and Monte Carlo's and its mechanics is you don't have to worry about any of that stuff because all that stuff gets subsumed into your team's historical burn rate. There's always someone who gets sick. There's always someone who's on vacation. There's always the meeting you thought would be half an hour that takes 3 hours. There's always the bug you thought would be 5 minutes to fix that took 5 days to fix. There's always the items that take a day. There's always the items that take 30 days. There's always the items that are in between. By not having to worry about that, that's what makes the Monte Carlo forecast so powerful, is by looking at throughput, none of that stuff matters. None of that stuff factors into anything at all. The only thing that matters is how often do we get stuff done. Now, at this point, some of you might be saying, well, but I've heard very important Kanban people talk about right sizing, and you have. Right sizing, however, is not the act of trying to make all your work items the same size. Right sizing means looking at your SLEs and using that as a guideline to see if you have an outlier coming up or not. So, for example, let's say 85% of my user stories are delivered in 13 days or less. So when my team is breaking out work items and we're talking about it, I can ask the team, do you think this is going to take more than 13 days? Well, the only way we're going to know that is if it's blindingly obvious, right? No one's going to be like, well, I think it might take 14 days. No one's going to say that, right? So it'd have to be blindingly obvious that this item is more than 13 days worth of work. Well, if it's blindingly obvious that this item is more than what our common sizes are, and 85% is getting toward the upper end of the scale, then that may be our cue to have a conversation about whether we've broken it down enough, right? Is this really an outlier? If it is, great, but the fact that this thing is going to take longer than the overwhelming majority of our work items, it gives us pause, right? It's room to have a conversation about whether we've really made this item as small as we can or not. Because here's the thing, every team trying to increase their agility, Scrum, Kanban, I don't care, should be trying to get their work items down to the smallest deliverable unit of value that you possibly can. We all should be doing that. We should always be trying to get that batch size as small as possible because small batches enable greater agility, right? If I get my work items down to things that take 2 to 5 days, well, we can be very agile. We can be very responsive, right? Because people will only be committed at any given time to 2 to 5 days, right? And then we can make new decisions about what to work on. But if I've got work items that take 40 days or 60 days or 90 days, well, that limits my agility, right? Because once that thing starts, then either I'm going to have to kill it in the middle of progress and waste all that effort, or I'm going to have to see it through to the end, which is an assumption of Little's Law, by the way. And I'm going to be tied up for 90 days. I can't pivot. I can't reprioritize. I can't do anything. I'm locked in. I'm an aircraft carrier trying to change direction at that point instead of a speedboat. So every team that cares about agility needs to be drilling their work items down to be as small of a deliverable as they can manage. And when you do that, just kind of by nature of the case, your work items tend to have small variances. everything is small, right? Takes a relatively short time. And so the things that take a long time are outliers, they're aberrations. They're things we tried to make smaller, but we simply could not. They're irreducible, and it just so happens that it's going to take a long time. That is a great situation to be in. So right sizing just simply means using your SLE as a guideline to identify those outliers and have a conversation. Is this really an outlier, or have we not done a great job about rigorously breaking this down into the smallest deliverable that we can? Every Agile team should be doing that. And that's why we should not have work items that take 6 months, right? All of our work items should be, within a few days or weeks of each other, because we are rigorously trying to break them down to their smallest unit. So does work item size matter? No. It doesn't matter for your forecast to work. It doesn't matter for your Kanban system to work. Scrum is not, quote unquote, more forgiving because you use story points. In fact, if Kanban and Monte Carlo has taught us anything, it's that for planning purposes, the story points don't matter. You could count cards that you get done and have just as effective sprint planning as velocity will give you. We've proven that out many, many times over, right? So just to say, don't stress about work item size. Don't hold off trying Kanban or flow metrics or Monte Carlo simulations because your work item sizes are variable. All of our work item sizes are variable, and you do not need to artificially repackage them so that everything is the same size for these systems to work. They will work, and they will take into account all that variability. But having said that, don't let that be an excuse for having these gigantic epics dump themselves into your backlog. Make sure that you are still rigorous about the process of drilling things down to their smallest deliverable unit of value, because the better your team gets at that, the more agile you will ultimately become. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.